if I don't know yet whether the AI is going to choose reaction 1 or reaction 2, I'm like, okay, what do I do if I don't know? Should I try to predict? But I could be wrong because these emotional reactions are influenced by all the emotions going on. Hey, I'm Demon Dev, and I've been cooking a lot of ideas and progress on the game, so I thought I'd just kind of give an overview of some of the stuff that I'm excited about that's going on with Double Demons and Electra. So I'm gonna try to get into as much as I can. One, for people who haven't seen what I'm doing, and two, for my own notes so that I can kind of listen to it as I go back through and attach stuff and work with all the things that I've built. So at the very beginning of all of this is basically dialogue choice. I wanted to give the player, say this is the game, choices A and B. I wanted them to matter. And that is a complicated question. How do you make this decision matter? Well, the most obvious thing is that you have different things happen. So, and this is how kind of traditional dialogue branching works. If you choose dialogue option A, which is hi, then maybe the character says hello back, or if you say bye and they say see ya. Different outcomes. That all makes sense and works really well. The problem is it's not very sustainable. So you basically have to find either a very limited number of choices because of if you think of this dot as a choice, every choice will lead to new choices and so on exponentially until it's totally unsustainable to carry on a conversation or a sequence of events as far as narrative content goes beyond 5-10 choices. 1, 2, 3, 4. At 4 choices, you're already designing 8 possible branches if each of those branches has a branch, and then it goes all the way up to 16 at 5 choices. Anyways, so what are the other ways you can make decisions matter? Well, there's a lot of people who are a fan of the illusion of choice, which is basically you give them the option, and then either way, it will go to the same result in game. And that's really popular for a lot of reasons. One is it doesn't have the exponential branching. So normally that would become 2, but this decision point always goes to the same one. And so if you don't have any real branching, you could think of them as, having these choices, but the same outcome always applies. Then you can scale that infinitely long. The problem is if players choose a choice that doesn't seem to resonate with the response, that doesn't feel very good and ultimately undermines the point of having a choice in there. It can be confusing to write in a generic enough way to make both options work for a response, and is kind of not a mechanic if your choice doesn't matter with any degree. Now you can mix that together with real choices. The problem is most games, other than maybe the drama of the situation, and even then, the difference between a real choice and a fake choice is usually not made obvious. They purposely want to lean into the possibility that most or all choices matter. So you're actually become desensitized to basically a bunch of meaningless choices, and then it does matter very arbitrarily. So you kind of haven't built up any skill set or sense of consequences. It just kind of happens to matter at some point. Now, a lot of games do this because it's a sustainable content. Like if you have a suspended kind of line of no branching and then branching, you can more easily sustain that rather than the exponential branching at every single phase. But again, you're not teaching the players the skills to identify when a choice might matter, let alone any properties of the choices that might factor into that. Usually, when you have dialogue choices, like if you think of a hostage negotiation, you have a more aggro option and you have a more gentle one for like telling them to not kill the hostage, I guess. Usually the answers themselves are tied to being bad and good. So, assuming you don't want the hostage to die, maybe in this situation, gentle just always is the correct answer. Now, there might be, points of, maybe make this into exclamation points. There might be information that's placed like in the scene to help lead you to which choice they want you to choose, but that choice is just hard locked to being the right choice as far as linked to a positive outcome. There's no situation in which the aggro choice could get to the good. And that was actually one of the primary things that I wanted to solve when I got into working on a dialogue system and on a dating sim. Was trying to solve that, because sometimes in playing games that already exist, I would be like, I really like the aggressive option, and I think that maybe given other play styles, like maybe you have like a super scary build where you're covered in guns or knives or something like that, so maybe the aggressive, there could be other factors that weigh into where a choice ends up in terms of outcome. So something, you have the choice, you have other factors, you have a reaction formula, and then that selects from multiple outcomes. Okay, reaction 1, reaction 2. And that might still be the same as bad and good, but the big difference is in this, both choices are linked to both possible outcomes. So maybe the aggressive option with the right other factors could lead to the higher result. Maybe with the wrong other factors will leads to the lower result, and the gentle choice with the right other factors would go to the higher choice, and the wrong other factors would go to the lower choice. But there would be different factors factored in, which allows for the play style. So you could be the more assertive or aggressive hostage negotiator if your build or other relationship factors align with what is required in the reaction formula based on that to get your results. So I was very into that idea. As you can see, we're already getting very complex and not necessarily replacing the exponential branching problem. We're creating a sort of more cubic exponent problem. So what the kind of dot version of this is, if you have one dot representing a true branching choice and that going to two options. In the traditional branching, it would be more like this. A always goes to reaction 1, B always goes to reaction 2. Basically, what I'm proposing is that you have a choice of A and B, and both the choices go into a reaction process, and that reaction process determines whether you get R1 or R2. Now, that might seem like a completely convoluted, unnecessary complication, but something really beautiful happens here, which is that it can be possible sometimes for A or B to be right or wrong. So if you really are attached to one option, there might be a way to still get your preferred outcome. And then also, I'm actually extending agency in a very real way to AIs. So they actually have a reaction that gives them a choice, regardless of what you choose. So in my game, which is not a hostage negotiation most of the time, but more so like dating, attraction, asking girls or guys out, the game kind of revolves around what you're saying in the moment and how you're saying it, plus your relationship. So that's the other factor that I bring into the case. So one of the primary relationships variables would be friendship, and friendship is a type of reaction formula basis. So a reaction formula that uses friendship, we'll take that value on a scale of 0 to 10. Maybe default friendship is 5, so very neutral. And then it adds together emotional components from your choices. So maybe A has a friendship relevant affecting factor of like +1, and B has a friendship affecting value of -1. So if you choose A, the reaction will be friendship of 5 + 1, so that would be a 6. So I guess we could say player choice A, would end up being a 6, and then player choice B would end up being a 4. If the components of that was like -1, assuming that your friendship is a 5 out of 10. And then you just take that value and you assign points on the scale of the 0 to 10 to being those reactions. So since we're back in the dating sim landscape, maybe option A is a compliment, and option B is more of a teasing or insult. So both those go in, and on the 0 to 10 scale, A, in this case, ends up at a 6 out of 10, and B ends up at a 4 out of 10. Coming from, and I use little heart icons to represent friendship formulas. So depending on what you choose, and this represents the internal emotional reaction of the AI. The rating for B is 4, rating for option A is 6. So what we do here is then the AI's reactions that they can react with, R1 and R2, are put anywhere you want on the scale. That's up to the writer. So the writer might, maybe in this situation where the player is either giving a compliment or being more teasing. It could be a conversation about the character's outfit, like what they chose to wear to homecoming or something like that. So it might be that this character hates getting any sorts of comments on their appearance. So the writer might determine that on the 0 to 10 scale, reaction 1 is like 1 out of 10. And reaction 2 is only like a 3 out of 10. So either way, they're not a huge fan. But if your friendship is high, or you're saying things in the A way, so you get that bump up 1, then it's going to choose the closest reaction. So if we move the heart over to where the rating ends up being, when we add in the emotional tone plus the friendship factors, what happens now? Well, then this is a very big distinction between the kind of the AI approach that I'm taking and AI that exists in most other places. Um, the first thought you probably have is like, oh, well, the writer needs to write a response, needs to add a third response that matches this emotional value of a 6 out of 10. So they kind of like your comment. But something that I realized that I think is actually really cool is I'm like, no, that's actually up to the writer's discretion. I think it's the writer can respect the character and basically say, no, they just really didn't want any comments about their outfit to homecoming. So if you say let's see, in this case, a compliment bumps up to a 6, the AI will choose the closest reaction possible. So an emotional internal reaction of a 6, but the closest thing they can say is a 3. Boop. So what happens because of that? Well, because the AI is saying something, is saying reaction 2, which is a 3 out of a 10, which is a more negative reaction on a scale of 0 to 10. So like bad or mean in some contextual way, which is up to the writer to write. The math really determines the selection. The writer puts what is possible. Because of that, the difference in emotional, like what they feel emotionally versus what they actually end up saying, is tracked in the relationship. So in this case, they're reacting with a 3 out of a 10 that's worse than the 6 out of 10 that they were feeling. Like they emotionally liked the compliment, but contextually couldn't think of any way to respond, or just were annoyed by the situation. So they're being meaner than they authentically feel emotionally because of context, which is valid. Sometimes you want to give someone the benefit of the doubt, or like kind of liked the vibes of someone, but you didn't like what they actually said, and you're allowed to react that way. So it snaps down to reaction 2. But we watch where it came from. So because the AI was emotionally feeling like they wanted to be nicer, they actually store that 3 points of jumping distance, that snapping distance, as guilt. So guilt is manifested by basically saying, okay, the AI character is being meaner to the player emotionally than they actually genuinely feel in their head. This is a lot of mind reading going on. The AI is feeling 6 out of a 10, but what they end up saying is 3 out of 10. So they're being meaner than they kind of have a sense that they feel like they should be. So that's stored as guilt. Well, what do we do with guilt? This is one of my favorite parts of the system. So I've been saying 0 to 10 a lot. This is the reaction formula, takes in all the factors and uses that to find the kind of the true emotional value on the 0 to 10 scale, and then it'll find the closest written response on the 0 to 10 scale. So what guilt actually does is it starts to fill in the minimum reaction that they snap from. So normally when you first meet people, generally they don't have any guilt, which is another way of saying that with the way that the math works for the reactions in the game is if a AI has no guilt, then they do not feel bad, and so they will be totally open to reacting with a 0 out of 10 to it, something you say. So if your first interaction is saying, I don't know, what's up, ugly face, and they really don't like that, instead of thinking it's funny, and they have an emotional reaction that's a 0 out of 10, then that is where their emotional reaction will go to. But like before, if they're treating you overall worse than what they feel, so their guilt bar is going up based on this jumping down is what makes the guilt come up, then instead of a 0 out of 10 emotional reaction being treated like a 0 out of 10, it starts kind of getting floored up. So let's say they've been treating you bad. It's sort of like a tsundere situation. They want to be nicer to you, but they just can't because of how their personality is or the context. They just maybe do a bunch of goofs that make them frustrated, even though they emotionally resonate. They can never really express that. Let's say that there's a really high, like 7 out of 10 guilt. What that means is even if you say something terrible, like, hey, ugly face, and their true emotional reaction is a 0 out of a 10, the guilt will bump their kind of new emotional reaction to a 7 out of 10. And this ends up being very complex, but very mechanically interesting, because if the writer reactions has a writer reaction 1 of 3 and a writer reaction 2 of like 9, normally if you say something terrible like, hey, ugly face, you would expect it to select the worst response. But because they feel so guilty, they are most likely to select the higher response, which is actually fascinating because I'm still tracking their unburdened by guilt and guilt reaction at this phase. So what that ends up doing is basically watching this jumping value. Oh gosh. So what's effectively happened here is there's a true emotional reaction of 0 out of 10, but with the guilt factored in, there is a guilt adjusted reaction of 7, which will have the AI reacting with a value of 9. So even though with the guilt kind of shoving it up here, the character's personality is still tracking what their true emotion is, so the non-guilt adjusted. So that actually means we're taking 9 points of jump, and the AI is treating you ridiculously better than they feel you deserve. They're doing that because they feel guilty, but they don't want to do that. So in this fascinating possible outcome mechanically with how the numbers work, when they are treating you worse than they're truly feeling, so the filled in heart being the true feelings, the ghost heart being guilt adjusted, what they end up selecting, with the reaction 2 that's really high, like maybe you ask them out and they really want to say no, like 0 out of 10, but they feel really guilty, so they say yes. This would actually add a ton of frustration, which is the exact opposite effect of guilt. So when they treat you worse and snap down, they feel guilty because they're being meaner to you than they want to be. When they're treating you better than they think you deserve, then they're getting frustrated. So 9 points of frustration would have the opposite of effect, where if they have a true emotional reaction that is like a 10 out of 10, well, they're very frustrated because they have this sense that they've been treating you better than you deserve from their subjective standpoint. So if the guilt is really high, it ends up being a ceiling that kind of clamps it from the right. So a really positive reaction, like maybe you're in a relationship and you ask them for a favor that they normally would want to do, like get you a coffee. If they're very frustrated with you, or they feel like they've been treating you nicer than you deserve, then they might be so frustrated that they say like no. And so anyways, that's some of the kind of underworkings of how I'm doing math. You could think of it as my approach to kind of creating a spiritual counterpart in emotions and relationships to the way armor and magic resistance and ability power and attack damage kind of works in like League of Legends. Something like that goes all the way back to when you're choosing, option A or B, they could both possibly lead to the same outcome without the kind of forced branching, but rather this like potential branching where there's a decision process involved. But your relationship factors in quite a lot, especially the longer you get to know people. These like guilt and frustration kind of effects could have a massive effect on how they're treating you, completely different how they're feeling. And my hope is that will lead to a lot of conflict. Like if they're feeling really guilty to the point where they say yes when you ask them out, that doesn't actually result in a perpetual positive outcome. They would be very likely to cancel, or it would be very likely to be a very negative or awkward date, because you can't count on the guilt forever. And the more you do, the more likely like this situation will happen where the guilt is so high, they're treating you ridiculously nicer than they think you deserve. And so then the frustration gets really high. And when both guilt and frustration get really high, then it actually will trigger some sort of event where the AI will, one, either like avoid you or run away, or call you out for giving them these extremely difficult emotions. So I'm super, super excited about all that, but that is just the beginning, because this backend doesn't necessarily mean it will be a fun game. It is just a possible kind of math or like kind of layered reaction system that could make these sorts of complex behaviors exist. We still have to figure out, one, how to make it so that writing or writers can create like conversations or actions and events within this kind of a structure that the game can work with. This sort of A-B reaction 1-2. So this is not typically how writing works. Most of the time, if there's branching at all, it's either illusion breaking, where A and B both share one reaction, or A is always reaction 1 and B is always reaction 2. It is extremely rare to have A and B share 2 possible reactions. I guess a better way to put it might be to say A can be R1, A can be R2, B can be R1, B can be R2, based on the reaction. This is not how writers are used to writing. And this creates its own problem, which is what I call depth branching, which is, I think it's really important to give options to the player that are emotionally different but mean the same thing, and that way they can share the 2 responses. Because like we're back to one of the first problems, which is like, well, what if both options A and B don't make sense with reaction 1 and 2? The difference between saying hi and bye is not necessarily going to make both of the AI's reactions make sense. So I kind of tier this into what I call depth choices. So you might have choice A and B, and these would be what I call macro choices, or your traditional branching. So A has a set of reactions and B has a set of reactions, if you want it to branch. But both of these sets should have 2 choices. Now, the other type of branching that I'm talking about would be micro branching. So you have A1 and A2 and B1 and B2. So it's actually not necessary for you to have both types of branching at the same time. It could be either or. So an example of this would be saying hi or yo as 2 emotionally different ways of saying hi. You could imagine being connected to 2 possible results that could work for either. And bye or see ya could be 2 different emotional ways that an AI could respond with in either case. That might be more to do with your relationship or other factors. So that all works that, but how do you make it so that writers are writing this format? I've had a lot of videos about this. In the past, I've called it parallel dimension writing. But what that really just means is I think it's ideal for writers to write in this kind of this depth branching, so A1, A2, where you should just constantly be trying to write very tiny emotional variants of the same thing. So because these both mean kind of hi, they should be able to share two responses. Reaction 1, reaction 2. So it can go into either, can go into either. Yeah. So the idea with this is it's similar to the illusion branching, but the choices actually are having a subtle effect both on your end because you can choose different emotions and that's affecting your relationship. So that's why I kind of call it like depth branching. It's got to be a better way to draw this. Because even though it's not branching out in your kind of your traditional like ways, different things are happening. So kind of crisscrossing in terms of, you know, saying this might move her friendship up or down in very tiny amounts that eventually accumulate so much that their reactions will be significantly different. So that was anyways something I decided on the writing end is basically having two text boxes and saying, okay, on the first pass for all scenes, don't worry about the crazy branches, the difference between them saying like, you know, hi and bye. Just focus on starting the conversation with hi and just do variants of that back and forth between the AI and player. And so the way that I kind of call this data structure in terms of how I'm saving it for Electra is this whole conversation would be a mega and then one row, so like a set of two options would be a chunk, and then each of these are called supers. And these are just the terms that I'm using. I used to kind of have a sub classification to kind of deal with the difference between macro and micro branching, but it ended up being way easier to just have super with kind of like a non-destructive variable for macro and micro so that you could reorganize whether two dialogue choices truly share the same two responses or they need separate, more of the crazy branching that works traditionally. Right. So you have mega chunk supers, and that would be one conversation. And if you have multiple conversations, so maybe you have this whole high thing, but there's like a whole separate thing going on at the same time, which would be maybe the actions, like maybe you're just doing some crafting. That works in the exact same way as the conversation does, but for actions. So you have two variants. Maybe you're crafting slowly and more carefully, or you're crafting quickly and more risky. Two emotional variants, same deal, but for actions. And those kind of would progress too. And just like with the shared reactions that are possible for both, you could have the shared reactions that are possible for both for here too. So maybe it's possible you could break what you're crafting doing it slowly, but it's probably less likely. And it's possible you could succeed with the risky and vice versa. So fail, succeed. And instead of using a reaction formula that's based on the relationship, you would use a reaction formula based on the crafting. So I guess that would just be like your skill, your basis of skill, plus the emotional component and how that weighs into the possibility of you succeeding. And maybe instead of the guilt and frustration coming from the object, it could be your engagement of some kind with the task or skill level or something like that, or how tired you are. Right. Now, one more important concept that I've been chasing for many years is the idea of combination. I really don't like what I call the park bench syndrome, which is you have two characters on a park bench talking. Now, in games, I extend this not just to literally sitting on a park bench, but basically what feels like a paused mode where the characters are just standing doing nothing but the talking. And when characters are standing doing nothing but the talking, and you have dialogue options, I've always found the pacing to be really slow. Even when I'm invested in the options, I feel like I'm constantly either spamming or like waiting and a little bit worried that I'll accidentally select an option because I'm kind of spamming through it. So there's kind of this disjointed, like, okay, like how long is this going to go? Are there going to be any choices that actually matter? Will I ever know if they matter until I like look it up or replay the game? So I wanted something that would exist concurrently with actions. So some way to combine the megas, which is what I've called Chrono Smash for a while. And that's just a term that I came up with to say, okay, what do you do with two megas? One is a conversation and one's crafting, like an action sequence. You chronologically smash them together. So if you have megas and chunks, the chunks being one specific kind of choice moment in the progression. You say hi, they say hi. You say, how was your day? They say good. Each one of those kind of jump sets of choices is a chunk. You would just have alternating chunks. So mega 1, chunk 1, mega 2, chunk 1, mega 1, chunk 2, mega 2, chunk 2, and then maybe you get way more focused on the crafting and kind of forget you're talking to anyone or they're having a break and responding. But this kind of bouncing back and forth helps solve the park bench issue, because then instead of you just being paused or kind of like just noodling, like kind of like running in a little circle or doing a bunch of bunny hopping, which is kind of like the kind of idle thing that you a lot of times do if the cutscene is not fully locked, but usually you're not doing much mechanically. In this way, you can kind of freely float back and forth if the controller scheme is set up enough where instead of just standing there, you are, grabbing different materials for crafting and bringing them over to the workbench to do something with them, and kind of progressing through that and kind of toggling back and forth with your choices of the conversation. And that was kind of my hope to solve one, the park bench problem, and to make conversations more interesting and not just nothing else going on at the same time. And hopefully optional too. I'd like to make it so you could focus just on the conversation or just on the items, but leaving it totally open to Chrono Smash, however you so choose. Now, this is a lot of decision making. So we're kind of getting back to the original thing, which is the game. Actually, let me keep moving down here. Now, in the game, how do you present these choices? Because if you're toggling back and forth between conversations sometimes and actions other times, if you have to move the camera back and forth, that's going to be really tiring. So I wanted some way to get back and forth, but have sort of like a shared interface where you could really quickly scrub through options. So I've got that set up reasonably well now, and you kind of have a shared flow where you can always be walking around, and depending on either what you're looking at or if you've decided, and this is, that's a whole topic, and maybe I'll split that into the next video. But basically, if you could pre-commit to simple enough options, whether it be in a conversation that you don't care that much about, so the player would be allowed to kind of pre-commit to saying something emotionally, and they can kind of autopilot on it, like just, like nodding your head type stuff would be one way that could work. Or for actions, if you're crafting, you're like, okay, I'm just going to make 1 billion lock picks, so you can spam that, and you're like, okay, you've got 10 log picks, and then at that point it should be automatically activated just on how close you are to the lore or the ore or whatever materials you need and close to the bench. You're kind of automatically kind of triggering that off, and then that way you can focus the rest of your attention on just the conversation selection that would be kind of interspersed in real time. So that is kind of the start of the core systems of all the stuff that's going on. Now, the preemptive choices brings up a huge can of worms, because what I'm saying is something's happening in real time, like they're talking to you, but you're thinking about choices that might happen in the future. And that actually brought up a bunch of really interesting challenges to solve, which is basically, how do I give the player an interface to look at choices that they might have in the future but might not? Because I really wanted to keep this open-ended chrono smashing where the progressions, they're written in an isolated manner, but they can be combined or like kind of dropped at any moment. Like you can just leave in the middle of a conversation. I don't want to hold players hostage in pause states. And if they're free to move around, they should be able to run away from people they're talking to. And that should not like force a mission failed, but that just needs to work basically. So how do I show choices from the future? Well, one, I didn't want the information to be completely overwhelming. Like if you're talking to someone and you're thinking about what you're going to say next, that's very natural, but you don't know what they're saying, what they're done saying yet. So if an AI is talking, how am I supposed to show you your choices before it's your turn to talk, which I need to do if I want preemptive choices to work? Well, when we kind of go back to the emotional components that are kind of giving the +1 or the -1, if I pair that with the choices, so maybe your words are, suck it. But emotionally, that can be expressed in two different ways, silly or mean. Maybe suck it is kind of silly, and a mean version would be like you suck, or like screw off, fuck off, something like that. So if this is a choice that's going to happen in the future, then what if I just give the player the emotional options and basically blur out or pixelate the words until it's their turn to talk? And that has been one of my favorite ideas that I've come up with. I think it's difficult to test without you having longer form conversations, which I've been able to get in and feel good about, but it could be pretty overwhelming. So maybe that's kind of like a mechanic that kind of gets dropped into the game a little bit of the ways in. But the really cool thing is, if you're able to kind of just look over the damage type, it's kind of like if you could see, like all of the moves of all your Pokemon, like you have 6 Pokemon, each with like 4 moves. You got 24 moves. If you could kind of see just the damage types, not all 24 moves, because that would be extremely annoying to scrub through, but the total number of damage type abilities, like as categories, that would be kind of like the idea of preempting an emotional choice in a conversation. And then I very much wanted to allow the player to pre-commit to that so the conversation could naturally flow. If you're thinking ahead, even just a couple seconds about what you might say next, you might not even see the unpixelated version of what words you say. So it might be a bit of a surprise what you end up saying, but the damage type, which is what's going to affect the reaction formula. So I've been super in love with that for a while, but figuring out how to present that to players just continually created way more complex problems. Like that probably makes some amount of sense until you think one step ahead, which is, okay, what if the AI hasn't finished reacting yet? I kind of want a consistent interface. So kind of no matter whether the AI is thinking or actively saying their reaction, I want the player to have something in their interface, which means if I don't know yet whether the AI is going to choose reaction 1 or reaction 2, each being connected to future choice 1 and 2, and future choice, I guess of 2, of reaction 1, R1 FC1 2, R2 FC1 2, and so these would be 2 player options. I'm like, okay, what do I do if I don't know? Should I try to predict? But I could be wrong because these emotional reactions are influenced by all the emotions going on from chrono smashing. So even just the way you're crafting something could have just enough influence to bump the AI's reaction to a different reaction. So I really don't know, and I kind of designed the system so you really don't fully know. And eventually, if you get good enough, you can specifically seek out certain emotional vibes of like things you're doing outside of the conversation to influence their reaction to you, as we do in real. We're not just like stiffly standing when we're talking to people. We're doing lots of stuff at the same time, and or if when we are, it's that could be really fun or very distracting and tough. But regardless, I wanted that, so I came up with the idea of chaos supers, which is a more recent term. If you've seen some other videos, chaos supers is, okay, what if I give the player all the possible options that they might have access to? So R1, F1, R1, F2, R2, F1, R2, F2. But these are exclusive options. So you could be scrubbing through these options and only 2 of these will be available by the time you get to talk. So that was really exciting too, because emotionally that would be basically like you guessing about the way they're going to react. Like maybe you ask them out, and then if they say yes, you have these 2 options. And if they say no, you have those 2 options. So maybe I give the player both, all 4 options that they could possibly have, until you know what the AI decides. And then I could basically have some sort of an animation. So like if the AI says no with R1, then I could have these options, even if you're hovering over them or even if you've pre-committed to them, basically play some sort of like a breaking animation and be like, oh, nope, this is not what you were expecting. And maybe there's some way to even encourage players to guess or gamble about that, so they can do other things at the same time, or so it kind of has like this sort of like confidence or surprise effect where you're like, oh, I was expecting a different response. So I'm super excited about that also. But that is only some of the story. So now we've covered some of the writing systems, some of the interface issues, as far as how do I get players to make these complicated both conversation and like action decisions preemptively, and sometimes chaotically preemptively by looking at options that might disappear once the AI makes up their mind about what they're saying at the very moment. But this is all okay. We covered a little bit of the writings tool, which is what I call Electra. So this what I call dual ultra, or you could think of it as dual supers. I think I was using ultras because I didn't know whether they were macro branching or micro branching. But basically this idea is each of these is a chunk. So you have the writing tool, but how do you give the player access to that? Well, recently I basically use what I call piles, which is a mega being all of these would be 1 mega. I basically have a pile of a bunch of megas. One could be the conversation, one could be the crafting, one could be like climbing up on something. It basically everything is just a bunch of megas, and piles are sort of like a chapter in the game or a scene that are a pile of megas, and they're, as much as possible, are all kind of optional and chrono smashable that can happen in any sequence where you're bouncing around between the different megas or pre-committing to a bunch of stuff and sort of doing some crazy speed running things where you're running around picking up all of a specific type of loot or talking to a person while you do it at the same time. So I'm super excited about that. But writing content is just half the battle. There's also the logic that gives AI's initiative to react to what the player is doing in any of these megas, which could be chrono smashed out of order, or to initiate megas that, if they have goals or motivations, which is part of what I'm working on right now, is giving the AIs motivations to pursue initiating megas or to prioritize which megas, such as a conversation or like a action progression, like getting themselves food or something like that, what should be prioritized based on a time management system that is player action based. But I think I will get to that in the future video. But the overall flow is you have writing, and then you have a huge set of custom tools that I've made to make voiceovers from the writing. Initially AI gen, so that I have something to play back during mocap recording. So I put on a full motion capture suit, and then I rig it up so that it saves an insane amount of animations per every super. And then when I tie the animations for every single super in a chunk, that kind of helps with the chrono smash, where there are character animations for them to do each thing. And then that's the game. Whole bunch of megas, a bunch of piles of megas, with each pile being a chapter. And that is some of what I've got going on. Thanks for listening. Have a good one. Bye.